started. If I can get your attention, I'm going to walk you through the argument now in Chapter 2 of the Section 3. So Chapter 2 is entitled Actuality. Section 3 of the Doctrine of Essence is called Actuality as well. I'm going to get to the handout at the end of it, so hold on. Some of the front part of that handout is really just trying to give you, as best I can, some account of what's going on and define each one of these concepts of possibility, actuality, contingency, and necessity in their formal, their real, and their absolute determinations. And then the back of what you've got here is literally me walking you through paragraph by paragraph the absolute necessity section. So we'll do that in just a moment. But let me build up to that by establishing some things that Hegel does in the prior section. So I'm going to start off with on page 478 in the contingency or formal actuality, possibility, and necessity. And he's arguing there from this claim, right, that we have now a unity of essence and being. We've shown that. Essence is the attribute, we could say, right? And being is the mode. And those are both moments of one absolute totality, what we can call the absolute. And it follows that whatever is actual must be possible. I think this is really pivotal, right? Because Hegel goes back to this claim repeatedly. Whatever is actual is possible. It seems like a fairly obvious thing, right? If it's actual, it must be possible. But Hegel's going to claim that that's the only real sense of possibility there can be. So there will not be any unactualized possibilities. Or better said, there won't be any unactual possibilities. We'll talk more about that as we move along. So the possible, that's the essence here. And when we're talking about the modality, it's the essence of it. Is thus, and let's use this term very broadly, the ground of the actual. So it can be ground in the sense of hierarchical, more fundamental than, right? But it is that which is the basis upon which the actual, that is being, comes to be. So from that relationship with the possible and the actual, two determinations of possibility now follow. This is on 479. I'm just going to point you to paragraphs here, and I'll come back and we'll look at other things in more detail. This is 479, the first full paragraph down on 479. This is 282 in the German. Sorry, 382 in the German. Hegel talks there about two determinations of possibility. The first determination of possibility, he calls it the positive determination of possibility. Is this simply this self-identity of possibility? What do we mean there by possibility? Possibility is everything is possible that does not, you have contracted self. Is that right? See if I can find it again. Yeah, so it's actually in the second paragraph down. I'm sorry, I apologize for that. According to the first merely positive side, everybody see where I'm at? Second full paragraph down on 479. Possibility is therefore the mere form determination of self-identity, or the form of essentiality. So he's taking us back all the way to those claims about what is it to be an essence. Possibility is an essence. Well, that means it's got to be a self-identity. And then look at what he says. As such, it is the relationless, indeterminate receptacle of everything in general. Now, we know that's what he claims about essences. There are no essences. They are just voids unto themselves. But look at what he says about it. In this formal sense of possibility, everything is possible that does not, and you have contracted self, right? That's a mistake in the translation. It's Widerspruch. It's contradicted self. So please mark that out. Technical term in Hegel, right? Contradiction. Worth keeping. So does not contract itself, does not contradict itself. Well, we know essences contradict themselves. Right? So Hegel's telling you there at that point, the possibility can't remain merely that which is self-identical, that which doesn't contradict itself, because as an essence, all essences contradict themselves. To be an essence is to be in contradiction. The realm of possibility is therefore limitless multiplicity, limitless manifoldness. But every manifold is determined in itself as against another. It possesses negation within it. Indifferent diversity, he's running you back through all the determinations of essence. Passes over as such into opposition, but opposition is contradiction, so that's the connection, right? So he's saying, but it is, possibility just is contradiction. Therefore, all things are just as much contradictory and hence impossible. And so he's shown you the claim there that because essence is self-contradiction, that possibility can't be simply this first determination, the formal determination of possibility, which just says anything that doesn't contradict itself is possible, which is the standard, right, definition of possibility, that which doesn't contradict itself. So then what must it be? Well, it must be not positive, but have this negative dimension. When we say that it's possible, right, he starts to unfold here the negative dimension of it. This is the two determinations. One's positive, just mere self-identity. The negative side of it is this positiveness of possibility. It's reflected, imminent reflectedness, right? Reflected, imminent reflectedness is the way to express that. What does that mean? It is dependent on another. It's dependent on something else. So to be possible means it's dependent on something else. Namely, it's dependent on being. That is, on actuality, to be what it is. Identity is always only a moment of a more fundamental whole. Essence is nothing without being is another way you can hear that, right? There is no possibility without actuality. So possibility is nothing detached from actuality. Possibility is always actual. Now that is odd. Then do we just collapse possibility into actuality and identify the two of them? Hegel wants to say no. What I'm saying is that, what Hegel's saying is that there is a sense in which we can talk about formal possibility as that which doesn't contradict itself. But of course, as an essence, it contradicts itself. So it has to be some moment within actuality. It's not equatable to actuality, but it means possibility is always what he's about to call real possibility. And every time you see real in this discussion of modality, think relational. It's there as a moment of relation. So it's possible only because there's this actual state of affairs that has this as a possibility that it bears within it. There are no non-actual possibilities sitting off someplace. There are no transcendent essences. It's the same point. He's now making a modal dimension. So for possibility to be what it is, it must be other than what it is because it's self-contradictory. It must thus become actuality. But then actuality is the unity of itself and possibility. Actuality is thus always a possible, one actualized possibility rather than another, one possible of many. As such, actuality is determined as, he calls it this on 480, next page over. This is 383 to 384 in the German. He says, actuality is determined as only possible, an actual whose other or opposite equally is. So that means that actuality, therefore, is contingency. It could be otherwise. It could be itself, but it could be otherwise than itself. So far, so good. Possibility, there is no possibility without actuality. So all possibility are possibilities, I'm using terms that Hegel doesn't use, lurking within actuality. Because they're born within or lurking within actuality, then you can say all actuality could be otherwise because it's possible that it be something other. That possibility it harbors within itself as actual. And because it could be otherwise than what it is, it's contingent. So at a certain point right here, at this moment, you could just step back and say, okay, here's what Hegel is saying. Hegel is saying essence relates to being in the following way. Essence just is the possibility inherent within being. And because essence is a possibility inherent within being, then being can always be otherwise than it is. Therefore, it's contingent. There's our modal account. We've left out a category, though. Necessity. Looks like there's nothing necessary here. Here's what Hegel says about that. So, actuality is determined here as only possible, an actual whose other or opposite equally is, and therefore it's contingent. But that means that all possibilities are actual. All possibilities are actual. They are the possibilities born within actuality itself. They exist rather than merely are thought. Hegel knows what he's doing, right? The standard account of possibilities is that which is thinkable as non-contradictory. And he's saying that actually doesn't work because that's ascribing that there is some kind of transcendent set of possibilities, like transcendent essences, that are never appearing, never showing themselves. Well, possibility has got to be harbored within actuality itself. Therefore, the only sense of essence we can talk about is an essence that's harbored within being itself. So there's not two dimensions now. There's not the essence dimension up here and the being dimension down here. There's essence within being itself. It's one plane. Both born within themselves, each other. He then says, this is on 480, at the end of the third paragraph up from the bottom, at the end of that paragraph, he writes, everything possible has therefore in general a being or a concrete existence. Everything possible has a being or a concrete existence. This is him saying, look, these are not transcendent. They are born within actual itself. But, think about the other side of this. If being the actual just is possibility, and if all possibility is born within the actual, then actuality is a domain in which something could be, or its opposite could be. If it's possible, then it could be otherwise. It could realize one of those possibilities, and therefore be otherwise. It's not, but it could be. Therefore, it's contingent. It's wholly contingent whether a being is, or it's another being that is. He says on 480, second paragraph up from the bottom, this unity of possibility and actuality is contingency. Now again, as I said, if you stop there, you go, okay, I can kind of buy that. Right? So far, so good. I mean, you did take away from me the sense of possibility as a thought, right? That's never been materialized. It's just not a contradiction. So it's not a round square, yay, met the qualification. Doesn't violate that requirement. But unicorns, right? Fairy tales. These are all wonderful things to have. Why can't we have them? And Hegel's saying, well, you can have them. They're just not part of the ontology of the world. Okay. So what is possibility then? Possibility is not thought non-contradictions. What is it? It's the possibilities born within actual states of affairs. Actual states of affairs. But that means those states of affairs, because they're inhabited by possibility, could be otherwise than they are. They could be actualized otherwise than they currently are actualized. That makes them contingent. So far, so good? Now again, if you stop there, you could say, Hegel has just argued for an absolute that is radically contingent. He's just shown you that because there are no possibilities that exist outside or can exist outside of actuality, because actuality is inhabited by possibility, and possibility is necessarily born within actuality, that actuality is necessarily contingent, that there's a thoroughgoing contingency of actuality. There's a thoroughgoing contingency of everything. The absolute is contingent. It's completely, that's what he's arguing. Look at what he does with this. He says this contingency has a twofold dimension, a twofold determination. He lays this out on 480 to 481. He says the bottom of page 480, the contingent thus presents these two sides. These two sides, the last two lines on page 480, going over to 481. What's the two sides? Well, the contingent means it's at once groundless, there's no ground here, and at the same moment, grounded. Now the groundless makes sense, right? Because that's what this did. It did away with the essential relations, so we should be done with grounds, right? So they're all over with. So to say that all things could be otherwise means they're contingent. They could be otherwise than they are right now. There's no ground that holds them, tethers them, puts them in place. They could be otherwise than they are. They are groundless, precisely that sense. There is no reason, there is no ground why some contingent actual rather than its opposite exists. It just does because it does. And there's no rationality, there's no reason, there's no ground for that. It is its own ground. No particular possibility serves as a sufficient ground for the actual, for it could have been otherwise. In this sense, the contingent is groundless. So far, so good. That's one of the two sides he talks about. But then what's the other side? It's grounded. No, it's not. We did away with those grounds, right? We don't have the ground anymore. Right? Essence is a possibility born within actuality. So in what sense is it grounded? The actual is the actualization of the possible. The actual is the actualization of the possible. And thus the actual is grounded in the possible. You wouldn't get the actual if it wasn't possible. So it is an actualization of some dimension of possibility. So actuality is grounded in possibility, but as we know, this flips immediately. There's no possibility without actuality, so they're grounded in one another. That's why he says on 481, right, the second full paragraph down, the contingent thus has no ground because it is contingent. And for that same reason, it has a ground. It has no ground because this thing existing has no reason for its existence over that thing existing. Everything is thoroughgoing contingency. And yet, the only way in which a possibility is, sorry, do it the other way, the only way in which an actuality is as the actualization of a possibility. So the actual is grounded in the possible, but there is no possibility without the actual. You thought we were going to get ground back in the standard sense of one thing's tethered to the other side. No, they're actually mutually grounded in one another. So possibility is what it is only insofar as it is actual. The contingent thus has no ground because it is contingent. It's groundless, has no ground, groundless. And for that same reason, because it is contingent, it has a ground because it is contingent. Now at that point you want to say, okay, so contingency means several different things here. Yep, exactly. In one sense it means could be otherwise. To be contingent is could be otherwise. That's what that means. It doesn't have to be this way. It could be otherwise. Absolutely a sense in which he's appealing, to which he's appealing. But there's another sense of contingency, you see it here, that he begins to introduce. And that's dependent upon something else. Dependent upon something else. So, shorthand, otherwise contingency. Contingency means that something could be otherwise than it is, didn't have to be this way. Otherwise contingency. Second kind of contingency, we're going to get three. I'm just going to give you two for now. It's hard, it's bad enough. Right? Contingency also means dependency, so dependent contingency. One thing is contingent upon another. That's the way we say it in English, actually, right? One thing is dependent on, contingent on another. It's contingent on you doing this that you will receive that. So it's a dependency relationship. Now he says, this should begin to sound a little familiar to us. We've heard this kind of stuff before. Right here on page 481, some 480 pages from the first time he did this. He writes, as contingent, actuality and possibility are moments that immediately flow into one another. They overturn, they turn over into one another. There is no possibility without actuality, there's no actuality without possibility. That's literally what he just said. So they're grounded in one another, and yet because they're grounded in one another, they're groundless. There's no reason for the actual to be actual, there's no reason for the possible to be possible. It's just they're mutually determining of one another, that's it. So he calls this on 481 right in the middle, this is in the fourth full paragraph down, so 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a short paragraph. This absolute restlessness, okay, here we go, this is being nothing becoming again, right? This is literally all the way back to that. This absolute restlessness of the becoming, in case you didn't catch what he's showing at a much deeper level here, but that's what becoming is at that higher level. This is what it is the turning in its modal side, right? The modal dimension of manifestation, the modal dimension, the how it happens, right? The how of that, here it is, here's that becoming. Where do we see it? It's just possibility turning over into actuality, actuality turning over into possibility. This absolute restlessness, he's called it the conversion of one into the other above, right? Of the becoming of these two determinations is contingency. So contingency names the turning of the flow of one into the other, the flow of actuality into possibility, possibility into actuality. But for this reason, because each determination immediately turns into the opposite, in this opposite, each equally rejoins itself, and this identity of the two, of each and the other, is, this can't possibly be right, necessity. Now, that's where you ought to go, I was with you until you said that was necessity. Because, my God, that ain't necessity. Necessity is could not be otherwise. Yes? It's the exact opposite of contingency. Could be otherwise. So, how are those equated here? How are they the same? So, Hegel up to this point has said, look, the world is thoroughgoingly contingent. Why? Because possibility and actuality are necessarily determining one another. They ground one another. Because they ground one another, you can't have one without the other. They ground one another, they render everything groundless. If there is no actuality without possibility, then that means that all actuality could be otherwise than it is. It's contingent. If there can be no possibility without actuality, then all possibility has to be grounded in actuality. So they're dependent on one another. So they're thoroughly contingent. Hegel's point is right, they are. Because they're thoroughly contingent upon one another. Contingent in the sense of dependent on one another. no actuality without possibility, no possibility without actuality, then it's not just the case that they could be otherwise. That's true. That's true, they could be otherwise. But that condition that actuality could be otherwise, that's necessary. Did Hegel just play a trick on us? I mean, it kind of sounds like it. He just said things are thoroughgoingly contingent, and because they're thoroughgoingly contingent, they're necessary. And that's exactly what he just said. How does that make sense? It makes sense this way, that things are necessarily contingent. Things are necessarily such that they could be otherwise. That's not eliminable from them. So every reality, every actual state of affairs has born within it possibility. Because it has possibility born within it, it could be otherwise, yes? If that's ineliminable from actuality, you can't get rid of all the possibility, it could be otherwise, and you can't, that's what the argument has just shown, then it's necessary that they be contingent. That's what he's claiming. Now this is a very important, I'm going to give it shorter shrift than most people give it, but it's a very important moment in the science of logic. Because what Hegel just showed is that it's necessary that there be contingency. One of the standard refutations of rationalist logic of all kinds, Hegel's included, was can you demonstrate the necessity that this particular pen, Krug's pen is what it's called, Krug's pen is sitting on this table at this particular position at this particular time of day. That's the challenge back, right? If you really got a logic that says it can account for all of the nature of reality, then demonstrate that this belongs here, must be there of necessity. And Hegel's response to that is, that's ludicrous. I can't demonstrate that that's there. Nobody should have to demonstrate that that's there. But what I can demonstrate is that it's contingent that it be somewhere. It could be there, it could be someplace else. That we can show. The contingency is a necessary feature of actuality? Absolutely, and that's what he's just shown. This is called the necessity of contingency. So does Hegel get rid of contingency in the sense of could be otherwise? No. Does he get rid of contingency in the sense of dependency? No, he actually shows that it's necessary that things could be otherwise and that things are dependent on one another. So everything's thoroughly going dependent on one another, and therefore everything could be otherwise than it is. That's Hegel's view. And that's what he just wants to say, because we've been able to show this conceptually. This isn't an observation about the nature of reality. Right? I found it to be the case that, damn, I can't predict where things are going to be, so the world's contingent. Right? I'm caricaturing, but that kind of appeal to fact argument for contingency. He's saying, no, actually, possibility and actuality are ineliminable from one another, and because of that, they're necessary for one another, and if they're necessary for one another, that means that everything's contingent. Necessarily contingent. Not happens to be contingent, not contingently contingent, but it has to be contingent. It could not be otherwise than contingent. So the way Hegelians like to put this, right, is it could not be otherwise than to be otherwise. It could not be otherwise than it could be otherwise. It's necessary, it could not be otherwise, that it's contingent, that it could be otherwise. Now, this does take Hegel out of the we live in a thoroughgoing necessitarian world. He doesn't hold to that claim. He holds, in fact, to the claim that everything that obtains, everything that's actual, is what it is by virtue of it being what it is, but without any necessity behind it. It didn't have to be. As you're about to hear him say, it is because it is. Not anything deeper. Right? There's no reason lying deeper than that. There are no transcendent essences that have brought this about. There is no divine being that's brought this about. This is just the way it is. So Leibniz, sorry, God didn't create the best of all possible worlds. It's just the world that we have. There is no divine maker outside of all these possible worlds selecting the best one. None of that. It just is what it is by virtue of being what it is. Actuality is always encumbered with, infested with, tied up with possibility. Because it is, it has to be the case that it could be otherwise. That's its necessary feature. So now he says, right, immediately existent state of affairs, they are contingent in that it might be or might not be, but that condition of it might be or might not be is itself necessary. They could be otherwise. Consequently, as he puts it, this is on 481, the fifth full paragraph down, first line of that paragraph, the necessary is an actual. The necessary is an actual. As such, it is immediate, groundless. The necessary is groundless. That which is groundless. But it equally has its actuality through an other, or in its ground. So it doesn't have a ground and it has a ground. Yeah, exactly. Just like contingency. It's grounded in its possibility. Actuality is grounded in its possibility, but it's also groundless in its possibility. And is at the same time the positiveness of this ground and its reflection into itself. The possibility of the necessary is a sublated one. Takes up and cancels, preserves that relationship. The contingent is therefore necessary because the actual is determined as a possible. Its immediacy is consequently sublated and is repelled into the ground and in itself and into the grounded, equally because its possibility, this grounded relation, is simply sublated and posited as well. What is necessary is, and this existence is itself the necessary. What is necessary is, it exists, and it is as necessary. But it is as contingent by virtue of that necessity. Good so far? We've gotten a little bit of craziness, right? With this necessity and contingency, the necessity of contingency, as it's called. Hegel wants to take it one step further. He doesn't stop here. He wants to take it one step further. He wants to say, it's not only the case that contingency is necessary, which is what he's got on the table right now, right? That you can't eliminate the possibility of things being otherwise. They can always be otherwise. Nothing is absolutely necessary. Nothing, literally nothing, is absolutely necessary. Everything, anything that exists could be otherwise than it is. Notice, this is not your standard conception of an essence, right? Essences are supposed to tether and hold down and fix things. Possibility, which is essence here, because it's contradictory, has to be other than itself, it has to be actual. Because of that, what does it do? It's actually working as, not Hegel's term, mine, destabilizing. Right? It's disrupting everything. It's not tethering anything down. It's rendering everything completely contingent. Everything could change in a flashing of an eye. It could change immediately. It could be radically different than it is. But that's necessary. That's the case. So Hegel calls that relative necessity. Relative necessity. It's that the actual is dependent upon the possible. The actual is dependent upon the possible. It's relative necessity. For anything to be actual means that it must be an actualization of a possibility inherent within or within some actual state of affairs. He wants to distinguish that from what he calls, so that's relative necessity. We'll explore that now because we're moving into that discussion. From what he calls absolute necessity. Absolute necessity. Okay, so thus far, necessity has been determined in a wholly formal way. So I'm looking now at pages 482 and following. It's been determined in a wholly formal way as the impossibility of the opposite of any actuality. The impossibility of the opposite of any actuality. So it could not be otherwise. That's what we mean by necessity thus far. That's the formal conception, right? Just like contingency means could be otherwise, necessity in the formal sense means could not be otherwise. But what's its relative sense? To be formal here means that necessity and contingency have been shown to be moments, forms that share a common content. Possibility and actuality, that's their common content. However, as moments that are reciprocally determining, possibility and actuality are what they are necessarily, and this sense of the necessity of the reciprocal determination of one by the other is not merely formal, but real or relative. So it's not just the case that, hey, to have actuality, you also, along with it, you're going to get some possibility. And whenever you find some possibility, you're probably going to find along with it, some actuality. No, they actually ground one another. No possibility without actuality. That's where actualities come from, right? Is the actualization of possibility. But there is no possibility that exists outside of any kind of actuality. There's some pure possibilities. So Hegel's account of the concept of real or relative necessity begins then from the claim that for something to be, it necessarily must be contingent. For something to be actual, it must necessarily be contingent. Actual things may be or may not be. Let's start from there. Then he says, but insofar as something is, that is, insofar as it has actualized one set of concrete, let me use concrete as an expression for concrete possibilities, for actual possibilities, right? Real possibilities. So insofar as something is, that is, insofar as it is actualized one set of concrete possibilities rather than some other, it cannot be other than it is. Once it's realized that set of possibilities, it is what it is. It can't be other than that once it's realized. Now, it's still got possibilities within it, so it can change by virtue of that. But the actualization of that possibility, that's a done deal. It's over. And that is its necessity. Possibility is then that from which actuality emerges. But an actual state of affairs is what it is by virtue of the possibilities, that is, this is the language Hegel starts to use here, the conditions in which it is grounded. An actual state of affairs is what it is by virtue of the possibility. Those possibilities then are the conditions in which that state of affairs, that actual state of affairs, is grounded. The necessity of what is therefore relative to the set of concrete possibilities from which it has emerged, actualizing some of these possibilities rather than others, that's what we mean by relative necessity. Relative necessity is it had to come from possibility. It could not come from possibility, it had to come from possibility. So the antecedent contingent state of affairs is therefore, as Hegel says, this is on 484 right in the middle, he calls it there, the possibility of an other. Right? An antecedent contingent state of affairs, a pre-existing state of affairs, is the possibility of something that comes from it, something other that comes from it. But that enabling possibility, which is born within that antecedent state of affairs, is not just necessitating, here are the conditions, right? But it's also sufficient if and when all the conditions of some state of affairs are present. So once you get all the conditions in place for something to follow, it follows of necessity. That's how conditions work, right? Once you've got all the conditions, but you have to have all the conditions, then and only then does something follow from it. He says, this is on page 484, the second paragraph from the bottom, 484, second paragraph from the bottom, he says, look under 3 here on page 484, this is 388 in the German. The negation of real possibility is thus itself identity. Inasmuch as in its sublating, it is thus with itself the recoiling of the sublating, it is real necessity. When you see real there, think relative necessity. Relative means what's the relationship? What's the relative relationship between actuality and possibility? So he goes on to explain this. What is necessary cannot be otherwise, but what is only possible can be. For possibility is the in itself that is only positiveness and hence essentially otherness. Formal possibility is this identity as transition into the other as such, but real possibility, since it has the other moment of actuality within it, is already itself necessity. Real possibility is already itself necessity. It couldn't be otherwise than to be otherwise. And so there's this real possibility. Hence, what is really possible can no longer be otherwise. And this is a pivotal moment in the argument. Right? Notice what he's saying. What is really possible, not just what's formally possible, not just what is non-contradictory, but once something is a possibility within actuality, some state of affairs that are actually existent have within them a possibility that it could arise out of it. Then he's saying, what is really possible can no longer be otherwise. Well, sure they can. I mean, they just sit there, right? They don't have to be realized. They don't have to be actualized. They can just sit there in the actuality. They don't have to come to be, right? But he says, under the given conditions and circumstances, nothing else can follow. So once the conditions obtain, that possibility is going to be actualized. We don't know when, we don't know where, we don't know how, there's this contingency. But once the conditions obtain, it'll follow. What are the conditions? The conditions are states of affairs, actual states of affairs. That's all it can be. Real possibility and necessity are therefore only apparently distinguished. Real possibility and necessity are only apparently distinguished. Theirs is an identity that does not first come to be, but is already presupposed at their base. Real possibility is therefore a connection full of content, for the content is that identity existing in itself, which is indifferent to form. Now notice what he's doing here. He's saying, look, as a formal determination, possibility is empty. It's an identity that has nothing to itself. It's null and void, like essences always are, like essence itself. But once you put it in with, which we've had to do because that's the nature of what it is, with actuality, then it has the possibility to be something because the conditions could obtain, it actually could come about. Now, but only now, has it got content. So real possibility is different than formal possibility, because it's not just fairy tales and wishes and everything that doesn't contradict itself. It's the possibilities that are harbored within real, actual states of affairs. Now, I'd submit to you that we're seeing one outside today. State of affairs called rain is currently obtaining, last I checked, when I walked over. But that's because that was a real possibility within the state of affairs that existed prior to it raining. Hegel uses this very example, by the way. We have precious few examples. Here's finally an example in the science of logic. So let's take advantage of the weather conditions under which we live. And so he's saying, look, what you're seeing happen out there is an example of what? The example of possibility and actuality. The actual state of affairs was, born within it, was the possibility rain could happen. And eventually, the state of affairs arise to what? All the conditions obtain. And what happened when all the conditions obtain? Rain happened. Well, that possibility then went from being a possibility, a real possibility, to being an actuality. That's what was hitting us when we were walking in today, right? So that's an actuality. But it was a possibility, but a real possibility, not a non-contradictory thought, but a real possibility obtained within the state of affairs. But it didn't happen. It could rain, it could not rain. It's what we call a probability. We look at forecasts. What do they tell you? There's an 80% chance. Right. Why? Because there's no guarantee, there's no necessity in it taking place. But it's also ineliminable that it be contingent like that you can't get rid of the probability. There are no 100% forecasts. Sorry, I know it sometimes says that, but Hegel says the metaphysics don't support it. So, I know we love to be definitive, but the metaphysics ain't there. Everything is inhabited by possibility. Because it's inhabited by possibility, it could be otherwise than it is. That's ineliminable. But that sets up the problem of, well, then it's possible that it could rain. It could be probable given certain conditions. And under certain conditions, yeah, it's going to happen. But you don't know that until it's already happened. This is why you can't predict it. So far, so good. What are we seeing out here in the world? We're seeing actuality that has within it a state of affairs, has within it the possibility of rain. The conditions took place for it to rain, it now rained. So something moved from possibility to actuality. Now we've got a new state of affairs that obtained. It bears other possibilities within it, and we'll have to see if the conditions happen for something to emerge out of it. We don't know that it will, we don't know what it will be, but we know possibility is born within it. That the metaphysics supports. So that's what he's calling here real possibility, real actuality. Real here means relative, notice. The possible is relative always to the actuality. There's no possibility in itself. It's always relative to the state of affairs that it actually obtained. Real actuality, it's relative to the possibility that's born within it, that it could be otherwise than it currently is. Real contingency, the contingency means here not, it could be otherwise. That's still true. But the more important point here is that it depends on, right, contingency depends on whether this possibility obtains or not, depends on the prior state of affairs, the antecedent state of affairs, actually coming together to have the totality of conditions that give rise to this particular phenomenon, in this case, rain. So the groundedness of what is therefore its relative or real necessity. The groundedness that once those conditions obtain, it could not follow. Once the conditions of rain obtain, it's going to follow. It's going to rain. We just have a hard time predicting what those conditions are because we don't know. And the metaphysics doesn't let us know. But we can look back retrospectively. Right? This is everybody says thanks a lot for nothing when you say this, right? It must have been a possibility that it could have rained today. Well, yeah, it's 100% possibility it could have rained because it did. not terribly good on the prediction side, but retrospectively, we can now surmise that one of the features, one of the possibilities within the prior state of affairs was what? Rain. We can go one step further. It was not only a possibility, but somewhere along the course, the totality of conditions to make it rain happened. They obtained. Because why? Because it rained. It went from possibility to actuality. So once those totality of conditions are in place, you've got relative necessity, real necessity. When the totality of conditions are in place, it could not be the case that it not rain. So the groundedness of what is therefore its relative or real necessity. It is that contingent configuration out of which and only out of which subsequent states of affairs necessarily and imminently arise. The antecedent sets the parameters of the possibility for what can and must follow from it. It sets the parameters. The actualization of one set of possibilities from within a set of actual conditions rather than another thus necessitates and determines what follows. But we don't know if it will or not. We don't know if those will attain or not. That's not our choice, not our doings, not anyone else's doing either, just what happens. Consequently, the exact moment and manner of an object's coming to be, or passing away, or an event taking place, is the relatively necessary result of the set of contingent conditions by virtue of which a thing comes to be and exists. So Hegel famously says, once the conditions obtain, the thing necessarily follows. But when are the conditions necessarily obtaining? You don't know that until after the thing is actualized. It becomes an actuality. Then you can look back and say, oh, the conditions must have obtained. Otherwise it wouldn't be. But you can't look at a state of affairs and say, oh, of necessity this is going to happen. So you can have, Hegel doesn't put it this way, but I think you can put it this way. You can have retrospective view of necessity, but you can't have a prospective view of necessity. You can look back and see this must have followed because it had attained. So you can go back and say, oh, these conditions must have obtained, otherwise we wouldn't have this. But you can't look forward and say, because these conditions obtained, this will necessarily follow tomorrow, the next day, the future. Yeah.
Do you need to say this in such an epistemological language, or?
For the moment, yes, right? Because I'm trying to make the point, right, of what's going on. But Hegel wants to say that this isn't just an epistemological thing. This is an ontologically rooted thing. It's why your epistemology can't do better than this, right? We want to do better than this epistemologically. We want to be able to say, with absolute certitude, with absolute necessity, these conditions are obtaining, therefore this will follow from it. But prediction can't work that way. Why? Because we don't know what state of affairs will obtain. What state of affairs obtaining is not necessitated. Everything is thoroughly, could be otherwise, it's thoroughly contingent. So everything, I mean, what you can walk away from this saying, modally, everything is thoroughly contingent upon everything else. Because it's thoroughly contingent upon everything else, possibility is thoroughly contingent on actuality, actuality is thoroughly contingent on possibility, that necessity here exists in two senses. Necessity of contingency itself, it's ineliminable, you can't get rid of contingency. Contingency is a feature of the nature of reality itself. It could not be otherwise, that it could be otherwise. The necessity of contingency. But also, relative necessity now. If anything is obtaining, it is by virtue of the necessity of its conditions giving rise to it. Those conditions are in place, it necessarily follows. It necessarily emerges from it. Those are the ontological underpinnings for the epistemological formulations I was giving. Mom, does that make sense? Everybody okay so far? Please. Yeah.
So on epistemological versus ontological characterization of this, I suppose the important ontological point, then at least it seems to me, let's take the raining example, is that these the conditions that actually cause it to rain, like the hypothetical 100% that we don't have epistemological access to.
Right.
The ontological point is that there isn't even an ontological condition that is already preset for what that would be. I guess the condition's not hiding behind anything.
The conditions aren't hiding.
It's not hiding behind anything.
It's not lurking. It's not someplace else. We're just can't get to it or something like that. Exactly right. He's saying that in actuality, there is nothing but possibility, and when sufficient conditions arise, then yes, those possibilities are actualized, but they're not actualized otherwise. That's the modality of actuality itself.
Would it be fair then to sort of metaphorically say that whenever we're trying to find that condition for rain possibility, real possibility of rain being actualized, and we can't find that 100% condition, what we're running up against is formal contingency?
I would say you're running up against the necessity of contingency, right? Which is to say that everything could be otherwise than it is. Formal necessity just means it's not contradictory,
Okay.
right? We're talking about, you said contingency.
Formal contingency.
I'm sorry,
which
I'm
then
wrong. Formal contingency is exactly
necessary.
that. Yeah, so you're running up against formal contingency. That's exactly right. The other thing they could be otherwise than they are. Right? So there's introduces the dimension in the epistemological side, right? This is the ontological underpinnings for the uncertainty that's born within prediction. We good? Right. Take a look at the handout for just a moment. This is me trying to put together what we just walked through in the text a little bit, and trying to get some definitions on the table and hopefully make some sense of them. And then we'll turn to the absolute necessity stuff from that. So this is by way of review. So, this is a bit farcical to try to do this in terms of premise conclusion stuff, but I thought it was useful to lay this out in this way. So, let there be two real, this is one, after the quote. The quote's the quote about manifestation, which is what I think all of this really is spinning around. It's all trying to say, how is manifestation, what is manifestation, here's the how. This is the modality stuff, right, the modal aspect of it. So let there be two, this is not Hegel, right? You won't find this in Hegel. So go look at it in Hegel, it's nowhere in Hegel. But I'm trying to explicate or trying to give you some semblance of an example beyond the rain example, trying to give you some example of what's going on here in a kind of formal setting. So let there be two real, distinct, grounded, and thus actual events. So real beings, right? Call it event A and event B. Let event A contain the totality of conditions, that is the necessary and sufficient grounds for event B as real possibilities. So as an essence, right? So they function that way. So notice what's happening here, right? In the midst of all this, we've said a couple of things. Essences, on the essence side of things. Essences are self-contradictory. Because they're self-contradictory, they're void into themselves. But that means they've got to be a feature within the fabric of actuality. How are they a feature within the fabric of actuality? As possibility. As formal possibility? No. Because that takes us back to the vacuousness. They are contradictory as formal possibilities. But what are they then? Well, they're features within actual states of affairs that are possible to arise. So far, so good. But notice, if you ask Hegel, what do you mean by an essence? What could we mean by an essence ontologically? He would say, a real possibility born within a state of affairs. I submit to you that's not how we standardly understand essence, right? But that's Hegel's understanding of an essence. It's a set of features, at least modally. We'll talk about this in the causal terms in just next week. But modally, it means nothing other than a state of affairs bears within it possibility that could become actual. That's all we mean by it. So the conclusion you can draw from that is that event B, that is being, is the actualization. He calls it the reflection. Goes back and picks up that language again. Is the actualization of a set of real possibilities, the essence, contained in event A. Everybody okay with that? Make a little bit of sense? All I'm trying to do is say event A and event B have a relationship to one another. Event A is the totality of conditions that are realized by event B. So take your rain example, it's event B. Event A is whatever the totality of conditions that give rise to rain were. So far, so good? Now, let's walk those through the formal and the real definitions of possibility, contingency, actuality, and possibility. So you can say this, I think, this is right. Please, I'm tentative about this. This is me just trying to figure this stuff out. And one moment I just need to back out and say, okay, Hegel, what are you claiming about these various dimensions? This is me trying to get clear about that. So event A and event B are formally possible insofar as neither, as an actuality, contradicts itself. As an actuality, it doesn't contradict itself. And that's the key, right? Possibility has to be, in some sense, born within the actual. Right? The actuality must set it up. And in that regard, it can't contradict itself. It has to be actual. So both events are formally possible because they are features of actuality. Event A and event B are formally actual in that each is in that each is but one actualized possibility among many others, right? So there are many other things that could have happened. Here's what did happen. Both events are also formally contingent in that both could be or could not be. Here's the ineliminability of contingency. They could be or they could not be. There's no necessity in either state of affairs, either event happening. So this is my little note, right? Z1 is contingency, could be or could not be. That's the first sense of contingency, just to kind of keep track of these. Then you can say that event A and event B are formally necessary, and that for each, it is necessary that they could be or could not be. There's a necessity of contingency. So far, so good. I think that's what you can take out of the first discussion of formal possibility, actuality, contingency, and necessity. Now let's move to real or relative possibility, actuality, contingency, and necessity. Event A contains real possibilities for the actualization of event B, just insofar as an actuality, event A bears within it possibilities that together constitute, or could constitute, the necessary and sufficient conditions for event B. Straight out of what we've said. Event B is a real actuality, just insofar as its occurrence is solely a result of the necessary and sufficient conditions in event A. That's where they come from. It doesn't come from someplace else. It comes from whatever preceded it, the antecedent state of affairs. Event A and event B are real contingencies. Now, not just formally contingent, could be otherwise, but they're real contingencies in what sense? Because each is dependent on, here's contingency as dependency, not just could be otherwise, but dependent on the other. Each is dependent on the other. Right? Event A is dependent on event B is dependent on event A. They're contingent upon one another. They're related by virtue of the fact that event B is an actualization of what was merely a possibility within event A. So event A and event B are real contingencies because each is dependent on the other to be the real possibility. Event A are real actuality, event B, that they respectively are. There you have contingency now, not as could be otherwise, but as dependency. Just tracking that along. Then, get this, because this is where we're just ended. Event B, is the rain, right, follows of real necessity from event A, the totality of conditions that brought about the rain. Just insofar as event B is the rain, is wholly the result of the obtaining of its totality of conditions, the real possibilities, in event A, whatever those totality of conditions were for the rain. Now, I would suggest to you that that's a reasonable summation of where Hegel's gotten us to in terms not just of the formal claims about actuality, possibility, contingency, and necessity. So not just about essence as possibility, not just about being as actuality, and not just about their relation as necessity and contingency, but at their real determinations of those. So just to restate some things we've said before, there are no essences. There are real possibilities born within states of affairs, but there are no real essences in the sense that we standardly think about an essence as extractable from, distinguishable from the various things that it displays itself as. Hegel is not a realist about essence. He's going to be a realist about other things, but he's not a realist about essence. Essences are not real. God is dead. It's the same thing. So what is there? Well, do we just have the world in front of us and there's no interdependence of all things? No, everything is absolutely interdependent with everything else. That's the claim, right? Modally, everything is dependent on everything else to be. So it's necessary that things can be otherwise than they are, but it's also necessary that everything is dependent on everything else. We have formal necessity, real necessity. So essence and being, possibility and actuality, are one with one another, but that doesn't collapse them into one another. If they're collapsed into one another, then it's a void. The distinction between them is one's possibility, the other's actuality on the modal side. This will be different on the causality side, right? That we cause and effect. We'll come back to that. Substance and accident, cause and effect. We'll come back to that on the other side of this. Right now he's dealing with how is the absolute? Right? How does it exist? How does it manifest? What's the how of its manifestation? And right now the how of its manifestation is this. that it actualizes possibilities existing in prior states of affairs. And it actualizes those only, but absolutely when, those totality of conditions obtain. So far, so good? The reason why I'm checking with you about that is because we're about to descend into the murky mire of absolute necessity, right? Which, I don't want to mislead you, it's deep and dark and hard. So, look at the bottom of 485. This is what, if you look on the back of the page I've handed out to you, I'm trying to reconstruct there. So when it says paragraph, you see par 1 after the first one, par 2, that's the paragraphs in this section 485 over to 488. And by my count, there are 10 paragraphs here. 10 paragraphs. And I walk you through, I think, the first 5 in some detail here, but I can take you through all of them if you want, but the first 5 are the most important work here. So Hegel's going to argue something about necessity and contingency. He's going to say, look, I know I've shown so far, I'm going to summarize what he does, and then we can go through and unpack it in more detail. He's going to say, look, I know what I've shown thus far. What I've shown thus far is necessity, I've shown the necessity of contingency. And I've shown the necessity of contingency in 2 senses. I've shown the necessity of contingency in the sense that contingency means that things could be otherwise. So I've shown you that things are necessarily in the condition that they could always, ineliminably be otherwise than they are. So that's the necessity of contingency in the first sense of could be otherwise contingency. But I've also shown, so this is real, so that's formal necessity. Here's real necessity. I've also shown not just that things could be otherwise, but for things to be, they have to be the actualization of a prior set of possibilities. And that means that everything is thoroughgoingly dependent on everything else. Because for anything to be, it's dependent on a prior state of affairs obtaining in some state of affairs or others. But that's true of literally everything, not just the brain. You, me, the table, the walls, everything. Notice Hegel isn't saying, I know some things that this obtains for. That's not the nature of the argument. The nature of the argument is, here's what essence is, here's what being is. He's saying, literally, being is only insofar as it's the actualization of a prior set of concrete, real possibilities that were obtained within some prior state of affairs. But that prior state of affairs, this chicken egg problem. Prior state of affairs, right, had to also have possibilities that it arrived out of. So I've not only shown the necessity that everything could be otherwise, I've shown the necessity of everything is thoroughgoingly dependent on everything else. Contingency in the sense of could be otherwise, contingency in the sense of everything is contingent upon, everything's dependent upon everything else. Now, what I haven't shown, and I'm not about to, so don't get freaked out, what I haven't shown is that everything follows of necessity from everything that preceded it. If he showed that, then he could be called, rightfully, a necessitarian, because he will have eliminated all contingency. Everything that obtains is the result of everything that preceded it, of necessity. And it followed of necessity, right, in that sense of necessity. But he doesn't argue that. He says, look, what I've shown is that contingency as could be otherwise is absolutely necessary. And he never reneges on that, he never backs off of that. In fact, he's about to work through that again and show you what follows from that. And I've shown you that contingency in the sense of dependency, that there is no possibility without actuality, there's no actuality without possibility, there's no essence without being, there's no being without essence. I've shown you that's necessary too. That's real necessity. Now, what does that entail? It entails absolute necessity. What is absolute necessity? Absolute necessity is not the necessity of contingency in either of those prior 2 senses. Yes? It's not either one of those. It's not the necessity of contingency as could be otherwise, the necessity of contingency that dependency. Well, then what is it? It's not the necessity of contingency at all. Well, then what kind of necessity is it? It's the identification of necessity and contingency. The identification, that don't work. That's nuts. I mean, the other stuff, little loopy, a little crazy, but we can work through and make some sense of it, and it'll go all right eventually, right? So, the necessity of contingency, okay, that's cute, right? Things must be that they could be otherwise, that's cute, love that. And then the necessity of contingency in the sense of dependency, all right, everything has to depend on everything else. It's a wonderful world, right? We're all happy with everything's, it's not that wonderful, but okay, everything's dependent on one another, right? Thoroughgoing dependency of all things on one another. I can buy those things, right? That'll work. But this thing about necessity is contingency? Come on. That can't possibly be right. And yet here's what Hegel argues. Hegel argues that what do we mean by the actualization of a possibility? What do we mean by the actualization of a possibility? We mean that there is a prior state of affairs that bore within it a set of possibilities, concrete, real possibilities, right? That when we got all of them there, the totality of conditions, did what? Gave rise to the state of affairs that followed from it, event B in my calculation, my presentation. Okay. What's the big deal? I mean, that's just the actualization of a possibility. Hegel says, well, how does an actualization of a possibility occur? It's a possibility becoming actual, right? Manifesting as an actuality. How does that happen? How does that work? Well, a possibility is not just nothing. It's not just null and void. It also, remember we've been here before, it contradicts itself. Because it contradicts itself, it others itself. It negates itself. So when you have the totality of conditions, why does that give rise to something? Because they negate themselves. And in that negation, what do? They produce a second state of affairs. Event B in my calculation, my presentation, right? The rain. But that means that the negation, right, of possibility is the arrival of the emergence of the manifestation of actuality. Absolutely. That's exactly what he's claiming. Well, okay, what's the big deal about that? Two big deals about that. One is that's how manifestation works, is through negation. And because it's the negation of a possibility, the possibility is incorporated into the actuality. Because it's a negation of the possibility, the negation of the possibility didn't just go, possibilities be damned, go away now, we're going to have actuality. What it did was it negated them as possibles and realized them as actuals. It's possible that it rains. We get enough of these conditions, oh my God. Right? It's going to rain. It's raining. What happened? Negation of the possibilities as possibilities. What did they become? They obtained as actuals. Rain happened. Rain happened. What's the rain happen? The negation of the possibilities on the modal side. Right? There'll be more to this, right? We'll have to do more of this, but on the modal side, the how side, it's the negation of them as possibilities, the realization of them as actuality. So far, so good. So negation's doing this work, but that means the possibilities aren't separate from the actuality. Event A is not separate from event B. Event B incorporates event A into it by virtue of negation. Well, if that's true, by virtue of that negation, then the prior state of affairs is the, let's use this term very carefully, ground of that which followed from it. The totality of conditions is the ground for what followed from it. And now, negating them, they negate themselves. We don't negate them, nothing negates them, they negate themselves. And by virtue of that, what happens? We get something that arises out of them. Well, that means that those possibilities have been negated, but they've been incorporated by virtue of that negation. So the event that happened, event B, the rain, includes its ground within itself. It's self-grounded. Now, it's groundless, it could have not been, didn't have to rain. But once the totality of conditions are there, it follows a necessity, and that necessity is negation. Determinate negation. And by virtue of that, it caused itself. see this more on the causality side, but it grounds itself, it caused itself. But then its contingency, that it could be otherwise, that it's dependent on something else, is shown to really be features of the work of negation. Because it could be otherwise is what negation does. Its dependency is what negation does. But negation is just the same thing as necessity. Necessity and contingency are a negation. They're the same thing as one another. Not what we standardly meant by necessity? Right. Not what we standardly meant by contingency? Right. But Hegel's saying, I get it, I know. Right? I've been to my modal logic class, right? And what they taught us there was true, right? Contingency is that which could be otherwise, but also contingency means that which is dependent on other things. And I got those lessons, and I know that necessity means could not be otherwise, and things are of necessity, they follow of necessity from things that are part of it. I got that. I got that. But I just tried to think them through. You know, what do those necessary relations of contingency mean? And what they mean is that the only way this operates is if possibility negates itself, becomes other than itself. And if it becomes other than itself, then that othering of itself, its externalization. Remember Hegel says manifestation is nothing other than its externalization, its othering of itself. And that's all possibility is. Possibility is nothing unto itself. It is only in its actualization. But in being that, it comes to be the ground of that which is actualized out of it. But if that's the case, then negation is what renders them at once necessary. It follows of necessity from the totality of conditions, but it also what renders it contingent. It could be otherwise. It's dependent on its on prior actuality to have the possibility. So then, absolute necessity is nothing other than absolute contingency. Take a look on the front of the handout under 3, absolute necessity and contingency. This is the self-grounding groundlessness of all things. So event B is absolute actuality because as self-grounded, it could not be otherwise. It could not be. It's happening. So it's actual. Event B is also absolute possibility because as lacking any extrinsic ground, it is indifferent towards itself and thus can be either possibility or actuality. So now because it's happened, it bears within itself possibility. It's actual, but because it's actual, it bears other possibilities within itself. So it's absolute actuality and absolute possibility. It is, and it could be otherwise. Event A and event B are absolute contingencies because each is what it is by virtue of the negativity that posits them both. There is no possibility except for the possibility that's negated and gives rise to actuality. Possibility is something that's generated by determinate negation just as much as the actuality is. We like to think possibility exists and then, somehow or another it gets actualized. And Hegel's point is, no, actually possibilities are just as much posited, produced, as actualities are produced. So they're absolute contingencies. They could be otherwise. They're dependent on one another, yes, those senses of contingency, but ultimately they are products of the same process. They are both moments of determinate negation. So what does contingency ultimately mean? Determinate negation. So we can then say that event B, the rain, follows of absolute necessity from event A, just insofar as its actualization of the real possibilities in event A is a process of negation that on the one hand negates the real possibilities of event A as simply real possibilities. So it no longer is just real possibilities, they've been actually actualized. And on the other, integrates them into the actuality of event B as event B's own intrinsic ground. It doesn't leave them behind. Right? It integrates them into this is the canceling and preserving of sublation. It integrates them into the rain itself. So the totality of conditions is not lurking out there someplace still. It's born within the very event itself, raining. But that means it grounds itself. That's why we say it rains. Not something's doing the raining. There's not something over and above that does the raining. It just rains. It's an impersonal event. That's regnans. Hegel said, Heidegger said later. Now, we've got about 15 minutes. I'm not about to make it through 10 paragraphs in 15 minutes. But what I just said is what's going on there. You can trust me. Or we could take a little bit of a look at it by take a look at my characterization of it here that I've laid out in terms of conclusion form on the back of the handout. So let's go through that, and then I'll stop because I'll warn you out, no doubt about it at that point, and you can ask questions about it. So here's the way I've reconstructed this. I've tried to literally follow Hegel along. This is from paragraph 1 at the bottom of 485, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are on page 486. So real necessity has been shown to contain, so real necessity is where we start with, real, relative necessity, has been shown to contain contingency as the dependency relation of real actuality and real possibility. You can't have one without the other, right? No possibility without actuality, no actuality without possibility. That's paragraph 1. He's just reminding you, hey, look, the second sense of contingency, dependency, it's been shown. I've got that in place, right? Then he said, actuality couldn't, this is in the second paragraph, so this is the top of 483. 486. Actuality could not be, and is thus absolute actuality, because real necessity now is what it is most fundamentally. What most fundamentally is. So actuality could not be. It follows of necessity, because once you've got the totality of conditions, it necessarily follows. But as the immediate unity of real possibility and real actuality, or real necessity, absolute actuality is empty. That is, it is indifferent to any determinations, and as such, it's absolute possibility, because it could be actual or it could be possible. That's what he says in paragraph 3. So conclusion from that, absolute actuality and absolute possibility are both contingency. So once you got the totality of conditions, it follows of necessity, but it didn't have to follow. It could be otherwise. And then once you get the rain, once you get the second event, once you get the actuality, it's got born within it other possibilities. So it's contingent, it could be otherwise. Then he says in paragraphs, now going back to 1 and then 2 to 3, building up to the argument, in 4, he says, real necessity not only contains contingency in itself, as we saw in paragraph 1, but contingency comes to be or is conceptually derived in it. That's what he's claimed in paragraphs 2 through 3. But this coming to be of contingency in real necessity is, at the same time, the coming to be of necessity itself. Contingency thus just is necessity. Necessity just is contingency. But not as in the sense it could be otherwise, and not in the sense of dependency. So this is what he introduces in paragraph 4. Paragraph 4 is the hinge paragraph. It's where things really flip. So we've shown, right, that there's these two moments of contingency, but here we're talking about a sense of contingency that's equatable with necessity. Not that's a necessary condition that follows, right, but it's actually equatable with necessity itself. The demonstration that possibility and actuality are one, and thus that absolute actuality and absolute possibility both are contingency, is just the demonstration that the real possibility that real necessity presupposed was posited by real necessity itself. That it, in other words, generates its own conditions. It generates its own conditions. Actuality, so the rain generates its own conditions of rain. Those totality conditions obtain because negation is producing both of them. So that real necessity presupposed was posited by real necessity itself, that it, in other words, generates its own conditions, its own presupposition. Quote, that the presupposition which it had is its own positing. The presupposition is its own positing, its own producing. It produced that which it looked like it presupposed. It looked like it presupposed this totality of conditions. And then, oh yeah, we're waiting around for those to show up. Then once we get those, yeah, then we'll get something that follows from it. Actually, no. They didn't obtain without the event following from them. That's where the possibilities arise. Now you can do this epistemically. You can say, oh, I didn't realize those were the possibilities until I saw what followed from them. I didn't realize it was going to rain today until I saw the rain. And I went, oh yeah, I did have these conditions that give rise to rain. Oh, they were there the whole time. That's an epistemological framing of this problem, right? And there's plenty of explications of this that do that. Right? Do exactly that. That's not what Hegel's claiming. He's claiming that ontologically, you don't have the second event unless the second event actually creates the first event. And that means there's something that generates both of them. you're going to see another version of this when he talks about causality. He will literally say, the cause is produced by the effect. We all know that effects are produced by causes. He says, yeah, but the effect is what turns the thing into a cause. So similarly here, the event B causes, brings about, posits the possibility of its own realization. It grounds itself. What it presupposed, it posits. As such, real necessity shows itself to be nothing other than the conversion of possibility into actuality, and of actuality into possibility. Real necessity is the positive unity of possibility and actuality. Now, as this positive unity, possibility becomes possibility in and through becoming actual. Possibility becomes possibility, essence becomes essence, by virtue of becoming actual, by becoming being. And actuality also becomes actuality in and through coming to be as the actualization of real possibility. Being becomes being by virtue of realizing, actualizing possibility. Each, quote, each, as was shown, comes together only with itself in the other. Actuality comes to be itself only in the other. Possibility comes to be itself only in actuality. Quote now, this is on 46, line 22. This is in which paragraph? Yeah. Not finding it, hold on. Okay, sorry it takes so long. So look at the end of the fourth paragraph. It's right in the middle of the page. It's negative positing of these moments. Everybody see where I'm at? It's negative positing of these moments. The moments he's talking about are actuality and possibility. So its negative positing of these moments is thereby itself the presupposing or the positing of itself as sublated of the positing of immediacy. So real necessity therefore posits real possibility and real actuality, and thereby posits itself as nothing other than their unity, their immediacy. But then he writes, let's follow this down, but it is precisely in this positing that this actuality is determined as, you have as the negative, right? There's no the. It's just as negative. It's not the negative, it's just negative. So, yeah. But it is precisely in this positing, so the positing of actuality, the positing of possibility. It posits both, the producing of both. In this possibility, that this actuality is determined as negative. It rejoins itself from the actuality that was real possibility. This new actuality thus comes to be only out of its in itself. Comes to be out of its in itself. It comes to be out of its possibility. Out of the negation of itself. Consequently, it is at the same time immediately determined as possibility, as mediated by virtue of its negation. Drop down now to the end of that same paragraph. It is necessity itself, therefore, this is the definition of absolute necessity. It is necessity itself, therefore, that determines itself as contingency. In its being, it repels itself from itself. In this very repelling, has only returned to itself. And in this turning back, which is its being, has repelled itself from itself. It's negating itself. It's negating itself. So that's what contingency means. Ultimately, doesn't just mean could be otherwise, doesn't just mean dependency, it means all those things. But what's generating all that, what's generating all those relational properties, is a process. Determinate negation. That's what contingency is. The same is true of necessity. There are two names for the same damn thing. So he writes now, this is on page 486. Just the passage I just read there. It repels itself from itself. Now that's both necessity and contingency. So let me leave it at that. So if we're right about that, that's the right way to read that. I think that's the most plausible way of reading those very dense paragraphs. We'll come back and take a look at them again next week to see what you think. What he is claiming is that actuality and possibility are produced by determinate negation, so that they could be otherwise, that they are dependent on one another, is produced by negation. So what we ultimately mean by contingency is precisely determinate negation, because it's the fundamental meaning of what contingency is. It produces their dependency, it produces their could be otherwise. But it also is what we mean by necessity. Could not be otherwise follows from that same moment of determinate negation. Necessarily follows when the totality of conditions are in place is what we mean by necessity as well. All that's produced by determinate negation. So because they both are names for the same damn thing, they are the same. Now, Hegel pulls from there two limitations on this analysis. Two limitations on this analysis. Let me talk about those just very briefly, and then we'll be done. So one's a limitation, the other is an advance. Right? So there's a limitation here and an advance, not two limitations, one limitation and an advance. So let's talk about the limitation first. Hegel acknowledges here that the demonstration we've just traced, namely that necessity and contingency are in truth the same because they both denote the process of self-positing negation, determinate negation. He notes that that's nonetheless limited because the account ultimately gets at only the form of this process rather than its content. We're only talking about how does it happen, not what drives it, not what's pushing it forward, not its content, just its form. So necessity and contingency is how this process occurs, but that account does not itself tell us what this process produces. It doesn't get to the what question, just does the how. So how does this happen? Of necessity, of contingency, they mean the same thing, of determinate negation. And that produces actuality and possibility and their dependency on one another and the fact that they could be otherwise. All that follows from that. But he does note that this is a limitation because he says that what we mean by absolute necessity is that it's a blind collapse into otherness. Blind collapse into otherness. He calls it that on 392 in the German. This is on page 488 in the English. He comes back to this several times. He says, but this process at this point, at this level, is blind. He calls it a blind collapse into otherness, the blind transition of necessity. So we could say that absolute necessity, absolute contingency, they mean the same thing, is blind because it is proven to be nothing other than the absolute overturning, just nothing other than the overturning of actuality into possibility and possibility into actuality. It's blind, doesn't have any direction that it's headed. So absolute necessity is just the process of realizing the concrete possibilities inherent in a state of affairs, and of this new state of affairs, it's self-bearing another set of concrete possibilities, and so on, without any trajectory or destination. It's blind means it doesn't have any return back into itself. It doesn't know where it's going. It's not headed some direction. So here's necessity without teleology. Has no directness. It's blind. It doesn't know where it's going. It's just the continual overturning of, the churning through of things that they stand for a moment, and then they are undermined by themselves. That's the blindness of absolute necessity, absolute contingency. It is constantly possibility turning over into actuality, and then that actuality varying new possibilities, they're turning into more, but that's just without any destination, right? Without going any particular place or anywhere. There's no directness here. Now, I'm going to argue next quarter that there is no teleology in Hegel, but that's that. We'll get there. Here's the first clear indication where Hegel's saying this movement of determinate negation, which is absolute necessity, absolute contingency, has no ultimate direction that it's headed. Blind. Now, despite that blindness, there's the limitation. Right? It's blind. I take that to be this doesn't have a direction that it's headed. I take that to be a limitation. Hegel's not. Nothing that he said means that there's any kind of possibility at work here that's directing this. There's no final causality at work here that's directing this. None of that. You don't have any of that. So, but despite that blindness of the process, The continual overturning of possibility into actuality does mark, Hegel contends, a significant advance. To say that being is because it is, which is where he ends this, right? Being just is because it is. It creates itself. Right? Being is because the prior state of affairs, which is being, right, had a possibility within it. It was actualized. Being gives rise to being. To say that being is because it is just to say that being is by virtue of the absolute mediation of itself by itself. It mediates itself and thereby creates itself. Its actuality bears possibilities within it, thereby creates itself. It's the product of its own self-relating negativity. That's the absolute self-mediation of being. But it's no longer the simple grounded, concrete existence, that in which and by which the ground, essence, the inner appears. This isn't a moment of appearing. Essence as real possibility has been folded into the constitutive process. Essence as real possibility has been folded into the constitutive process, whereby actuality is what it is. And thus, being is not the appearance of essence. Being is not the appearance of essence. The essential relation, not the case. Rather, both being and essence are moments of the more fundamental process of manifestation. Because determinate negation is manifestation. Or absolute necessity, absolute contingency. Those are all names for the same thing. Accordingly, as this process of self-mediating identity, being is now determined as the movement of, this is what he's about to call it, this is on 394, so we'll get into this next week, the movement of accidentality. Accidentality. Substance and accident. Accidentality. Or what he also calls the actuosity of substance. And he's pushing it, right? What do these terms even mean? What's accidentality? I mean, I know what an accident is, what's born by a substance. And he's saying, right, but there is no substance without it being manifesting itself. How does it manifest itself? In its accidents. So what's substance? Accidentality. It's nothing other than that expressing and manifesting of itself. There's no substance other than its accidentality. Well, that means it has an actuosity about it, he says. So he says on 392, backing up, that this identity of being with itself in its negation, being with itself in its negation, right? It negates itself and becomes itself. Right? It generates its own self. That's the claim he's making, right? So how does it do this? What's the how of manifestation? It's the manifestation not of something, but the production of itself. It's self-manifesting. He says that's now substance, and it is this unity, substance, as in its negation or as in contingency, and so as relation to itself, it is substance. That's what substance is, in relationship to itself. What in the world does that mean? That's not our standard understanding of substance. So how did we move from modality, possibility, actuality, contingency, necessity, these modal terms, talking about the how of manifestation, to start talking about substance as the what of manifestation? How did that transition work? We'll take that up next week. I appreciate you staying over a little bit. See you next week, then. Thanks.